Mr. Bill Browder. Bill is the CEO of Hermitage Capital Management, the leader of the Global Magnitsky Justice Campaign, and the best-selling author of Red Notice, and of course his subsequent book, Freezing Order. Through Hermitage Capital Management, Bill was the largest foreign investor in Russia until 2005, when he was denied entry into the country and declared a threat to national security for exposing corruption in Russian state-owned companies. And in 2008, Bill's lawyer, Sergei Magnitsky, uncovered a massive fraud committed by Russian government officials that involved the theft of $230 million of state taxes. Sergei subsequently testified against state officials involved in this fraud and was subsequently arrested, imprisoned without trial, systematically tortured, abused, denied medical treatment, and subsequently died in prison, leaving behind a wife and 2 children. And since then, Bill has sought justice outside of Russia and started a global campaign for governments around the world to impose targeted visa bans and asset freezes on human rights abusers and highly corrupt officials. And he has since successfully convinced dozens of countries around the world, including the United States, Canada, the UK, the EU, and many others, to impose targeted sanctions with the passage of the Sergei Magnitsky Accountability Act. Ladies and gentlemen, it is a great honor and pleasure for us to welcome the one and only Mr. Bill Browder. Bill, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you, Mo. It's we've tried for a long time to make this happen, so we're finally here today. I'm sorry that I'm not in Canada doing it in person, but I hope to be one day. I have to say, and I'm not just saying this because we're on a Canadian conference call, but Canada is probably my favorite country to go and talk about these things, because for some reason, Canadians get this story like no other nationality, and so I always feel very warmly received when I come to Canada. So it's my not just because you're Canadian, but because you've pursued me for many years to do this. I'm here today and delighted to be here.
Yeah, no, thank you, Bill. And I'm not giving up on hosting you in Canada either, but thank you. We're really delighted that you could make it. So I mean, maybe I'll start with a personal curiosity, if I may. You've made this second career out of pursuing justice and really going after the most powerful, the most corrupt and ruthless individuals in the world, like the likes of Putin and his oligarch buddies. And arguably, Putin may hate you even more than Zelensky. So the question I keep asking myself, why are you still alive? Like, there are former oligarchs falling out of hotel windows. How have you managed to shield yourselves? And again, I get personal curiosity, but what precautions do you have to take day to day?
Well, I think that so Putin definitely hates my guts. There's no question about that. And probably the best, in addition to the death threats and the arrest warrants and all this other nastiness that he's sort of thrown my way, the best way of judging his anger towards me is that he actually mentions my name. So he has this policy of basically never mentioning the name of his enemies. So you'll never hear the words Alexei Navalny coming out of his mouth, or I believe even Zelensky. Yeah. I don't think he ever mentioned. And it's a weird mafia thing that your enemies are not human beings. They don't get names. And it's sort of he'll say, that activist or that person or that investor. But after the Magnitsky Act was passed in 2012, there was a press conference. It was December 2012. It was this very long press conference. And it's like this big thing where all of these journalists, they fill up a whole auditorium, and then journalists raise their hand, and it's usually softball questions. But like over the course of a number of hours, like 5 questions came in about the Magnitsky Act, and he just kept on getting angrier and angrier. And his face started crinkling up, and his forehead, and he's saying that Browder is a criminal. And he's been doing this ever since, and you can just see the anger. It's just like, he was a poker player who just lost his poker face when it came to me and mentions my name, which was pretty scary the first time I heard it. But in terms of why am I still alive, because I did something which is just the opposite of what every single person that I knew advised me to do. Everyone says, go to ground, shut your mouth, stop poking the bear. Mm-hmm. And if I had done that, the people get killed. And you mentioned there's like, I don't know, 30, 40, whatever, people who have all died of falling out of windows and suspicious deaths in the last 12 months, I don't think you could probably remember a single one of their names, because they're whatever they did that's caused people to want to kill them. And by the way, I don't think these are any of these things are political, or I think there's all dirty fights about money. But the way you get killed is by going to ground and being unknown. One of the ways, and this is not the only way by any means, but one of the most important ways that I've stayed alive is by being very, very public about everything.
Right.
Is to say, if anything happens to me, and this is a line in my first book, you'll know who did it, and they'll know that you know.
Yeah.
And so what does that do? That automatically raises the price by about 100 times the cost of assassination, because anyone that they want to go and do this knows that they'll probably end up getting caught. And
Right.
it's a very, very risky operation, because anything that happens to me, it's not like there's any mystery that it happened, or why it happened, or who did it. And then the question is, what information do we have? What trails do they lead, et cetera? And so people don't think that they can get away with it, which is one way. The other thing I should point out is that everybody thinks, and I don't want to sound, too confident here, because I'm not, but one of the things that we've noticed about the Russian assassination capabilities is that they're evil, and they don't respect laws, but they have really bad people doing their dirty work for them. And so, for example, in the Alexander Litvinenko assassination in 2006, the guys who did it, they tried 3 times, and every time they tried it, once they figured out what had happened, they left a trail of polonium sort of all over London. And the same thing with these guys, the ones who did the Salisbury poisonings of the Skripals. I mean, that was really this is even better. So these 2 guys, they do this Salisbury poisoning. They get pictures of them. This group called Bellingcat was able to look at yearbooks, military academy yearbooks, find their pictures, find their real names. Once they had their real names, they were able to find the cars that were registered to them. And then they found out that they all used the same car insurance company from the FSB assassination squad. And then they found out who else got the car insurance, and then they found out their passport numbers, and they broke open the entire assassination network. They call it I think it was the GRU, the International Military Intelligence Assassination Unit, and every single one of them were burned. They had to all leave their foreign posts. And so these guys are really clumsy, sort of knucklehead type things. This is not James Bond. This is C students from D universities who aren't very motivated, who are given these assignments. And so I'm not saying that that's what's kept me alive, but every one of their efforts has failed in 13 years. It doesn't mean that I mean, look, Salman Rushdie, 33 years after the fatwa was issued against him, he gets stabbed and loses sight in one eye and can't use one of his hands. It could have been killed if it had gone worse. And so it's not like I'm sitting back and saying, wow, I'm feeling safe. I'm not. But one is that there's a big cost. 2 is that they're amateurish. And 3, of course, I've got to take lots of precautions, which I won't share with you today, because then they wouldn't be precautions if I did.
Yeah. Well, it's funny. As we started this conversation, I was hearing a bunch of feedback loop, a bunch of feedback electronic. I don't know if you were hearing it on your end. And my first thought in my mind was like, oh, bloody Russians. There's a cyber attack on Lunch with Legends. I could feel it already. But anyway, I just out of curiosity, I mean, yes, they might be clumsy, but, they have led in many respects, some cyber efforts around the world and continue to disrupt governments. To what extent, number one is, to what extent have you been virtually attacked versus physically? And number 2, I mean, obviously you have the stomach. I mean, you really have stomach of steel, or perhaps other body parts, but how does your family live, or has lived, with the fear that their husbands or fathers' fight for justice has created some really powerful enemies around the world?
So they're constantly trying to penetrate my cyber capabilities, constant phishing expeditions and penetration. And so we have to have super high end technology to thwart that. But again, it's all based on how you function electronically, what you use, and most of it is not even technological. It's just sort of good good internet hygiene, um,
Mhm.
and being smart about it. But on the family side, my kids have grown up their whole life. So, I mean, this problem started in 2005. I was expelled from Russia in 2005, and so that's 18 years ago. So, most of my kids were born less than 18 years ago, and so they've all lived with this thing their whole life. No one's known any different. It's not like so when they were really young, I mean, like until they were about, I don't know, 9 or 10. The common assumption is aren't all fathers fighting with Putin? Isn't that what a father does? Um, and then as time goes on, it's just it just becomes part of life. And it's like if you live with someone who's diabetic in your family and you've got to do insulin every day, that's just how it works. And so there are certain things that their lives are slightly different than other people's, but in many ways their lives are not. And I try to keep them as grounded and level-headed and not neurotic as I can.
Right. Well, regardless, I would say your wife is a saint. But let me turn the conversation to your book, Freezing Order, and you talk a little bit about the book at the outset. We're effectively at the Helsinki Summit between Trump and Putin, where Trump almost handed you over to the Russians. And the two questions that kind of jumped out at me, and he kind of handed you over as a sort of in an exchange. So, firstly, putting aside your obvious, glaring personal bias, do you think it would have been a good trade? And and then number two, secondarily, where else have you been shocked by leaders, organizations, or even nation states that have been accomplices to Putin?
So the Trump the Trump summit in Helsinki with Putin was in July of 2018. The summit took place on a Monday. On the previous Friday, Robert Mueller had indicted 12 Russian military intelligence officers. And so the obvious question on the Monday was, will Putin hand them over? And that question was asked directly to Putin at the press conference. And he smiled in a very kind of self-confident way. And he said, yes, it's entirely possible we would do that. I should point out that there's a treaty between Russia and the United States. And if we did that, we would expect to, have this treaty honored where if we handed them over, then America hands over a Bill Browder. And that was kind of disturbing. But what was even more disturbing was then they asked Trump, the journalist asked Trump, what do you think of this? And he says, without missing a beat, I think it's an incredible offer. And he sat with that sort of conclusion for 4 days. And I was in America at the time. I normally am in London where they couldn't hand me over, but I was in America at the time. And for 4 days, that sort of hung out in the air until there was a vote in the Senate where they voted 98-0 not to hand me over. Well, would that have been a good trade? No, of course it would have been putting aside my own personal things, it wasn't just me. They asked for me, Putin asked for me, and then the next day he asked for 11 American government officials or ex-officials who had helped me with the Magnitsky Act. And first and foremost, if Trump had handed those people over, no one would ever go to work for the government again. Why would you work for the government if in one administration you do policy and then the next administration some president could hand you over to a hostile foreign power? I think there would be mass resignation certainly from anybody working in any contentious fields like the Department of Justice or the State Department or whatever. That's you just don't have. Secondly, I don't think that Putin would have ever gone through and handed his guys over because that's he's a criminal. He doesn't do that kind of stuff. Right. And thirdly, why would you? We didn't do anything wrong. These guys, these 12 military intelligence officers hacked an foreign election. All we did was get a piece of legislation passed to sanction human rights violators. Why would you hand over sort of human rights activists in exchange for known criminals?
Right. And so, again, just to the question on accomplices to Putin that surprised you.
Oh yeah, well, everyone has been an accomplice to Putin over the last 22 years since he's been in power. I mean, he's done so many terrible things. And things that are inexcusable. He invaded Georgia. He shot down MH17. He took Crimea. He carpet bombed Syria. He's involved in hacking elections. He's assassinated people all over the world. He's cheated in the Olympics. And all these people who are legitimate sort of leaders of our countries have allowed him to do this. And And by the way, that's the reason why why he's at war with Ukraine right now, is because he did a calculation saying, I think it's going to be just like all these other
Mhm.
situations where no one's going to ever touch me, because these guys are all so narrow-minded, so concerned about their own financial interests. The Germans with the gas, with the British with the money, or everybody in between, just not wanting any trouble with Putin. That everybody just, found ways of looking the other way. When he invaded Georgia, they said, well, it's not so clear who invaded who. When he took Crimea, they said, oh, this little green man, yeah, well, this is a civil war, we can't get involved. When he carpet bombed Syria, well, it's too complicated. I mean, everybody every time just, when they shot down MH17, well, we have to let the judicial process take its course. And then at the end of the judicial process, well, we can't go any further because we can't get any evidence from Russia. Everybody has looked the other way, and that's why. And so, I mean, there are people who are actively, supporting Putin. Gerhard Schroeder of Germany, he was the chancellor. He agreed to build a pipeline to bypass Ukraine, for gas. That Germany would then become more dependent on Russian gas after Russia had already used gas as a geopolitical weapon. They become more dependent on Russian gas, and then as soon as he's done with his chancellorhood, or ship, or whatever you call it, he goes and becomes a consultant to Gazprom. Just, I mean,
Incredible, incredible.
I mean, and by the way, I mean, there's a whole bunch of these guys. I mean, it's, he's the most stark example, but Jacob Zuma was taking money from the Russians and doing stuff with, he was going to sell out their entire electricity industry, which, by the way, doesn't work anymore in South Africa, to the Russians. I mean, there's all
It is
these
remarkable.
characters,
It is
all
remarkable.
all these characters, all of them, and so there's crimes of omission, which are the people who didn't do anything when Putin was acting badly, and crimes of commission, where people actually did bad stuff. And there's plenty of these people all over the place. There, a few of them are featured very nicely in my both my books, where you can see, people that should have been doing stuff the right thing, were doing the wrong thing.
So let's actually turn to some of the examples you've given specifically, and I guess in particular the Russian war in Ukraine. So so when the war started, one of the things you said was that Putin invaded Ukraine, or the invasion of Ukraine was really not a function of NATO, not a function of so many other things that have been speculated, but it really came down to money. Having stolen $1 trillion from the state, he kind of needed to distract the masses from the theft. Now, do you still believe that? Is that still the operating assumption on your end? And maybe you could elaborate on that a little bit.
So yeah, so yes, wholeheartedly, I think that. So what I've discovered in the last 13 years through the investigation of the murder of Sergei Magnitsky and the money laundering that was involved in that, that the $230 million that Sergei Magnitsky was killed over, part of that money went to Putin. And it turns out that that was only one of 1,000 similar crimes that I can point to.
Hmm.
And the number is actually 232 billion of money that we can identify that was stolen from the Russian state and laundered through Danske Bank in Estonia. And that this is all based on real money laundering investigations. And that's just one bank where we've actually had the opportunity to lift the hood. If we could lift the hood on Raiffeisen in Austria, and Deutsche in Germany, and UBS and Credit Suisse in Zurich, we would find a lot more money. I think $1 trillion. So you can't steal that kind of money and expect that your people are just going to say, "Oh, that's cool." If you steal that kind of money, then that's the money that should have been spent on healthcare and education and roads and public services, was instead spent on private jets and yachts and villas and Swiss bank accounts and mistresses and all sorts of other nonsense. And you just can't do that for a very long time and expect to stay in power. And the problem for Putin is that if he doesn't stay in power, he doesn't get to keep the money he stole. He goes to jail, and he dies. And so for him, it's a catastrophic outcome. He's stolen too much money, and if the people come for him, and it's not like Boris Johnson loses his job as the prime minister and he's off on the lecture circuit, jolly as ever, earning more money than no, Putin dies, and
Right.
so he's played it. He overplayed his hand, and so he's got this terrible situation where he doesn't want to die. He has no morals. He's been a serial killer his whole presidency killing people whenever he needed to for various purposes, money mostly, and now he's got to stay alive. And so what do you do if you think your people are going to come for you at some point? And he doesn't know when they're going to come for him. It's like in Tunisia when the fruit seller set himself on fire, and then all of a sudden that was the Arab Spring. Putin doesn't know when that's going to happen, and it's not like he's confidently thinking it's not going to happen. It's happened in Kazakhstan just in January last year, where the Nursultan Nazarbayev, who is even bigger crook than Putin per capita, he raised the price of liquefied petroleum gas, which people use to operate their cars and heat their homes, and all of a sudden the whole thing blows up, and he's no longer in power, and all of his oligarchs are fleeing, with their tails between their legs on their private jets to Dubai or wherever they can get to. And so Putin understands that he's got to do something. So what do you do if you're an oligarch? I mean, if you're a leader who's desperate to stay alive, you find a foreign enemy, and you try to distract any anger that may come towards the foreign enemy, and you start a war, and that's what happened in Ukraine.
So, but I think the question I would ask is then, doesn't that compound the issue? I mean, presumably $1 billion a day that's going to fight this war is again not being spent on other things for the country that are needed. And I'd love to hear your thoughts on what those might be and what those longer term implications. But I guess I'm wondering is this ultimately the end? Is like Ukraine the Achilles heel that brings Putin down? I mean, how else does he get out of this? And when and how does this end?
It doesn't end. It sadly doesn't end. So, I mean, there's really the most important thing about my little scenario, the $1 trillion distraction scenario versus the theory that NATO is what caused this, is that that if you believe my version of events, then there's nothing we can do that would negotiate. There's no settlement you can negotiate. If you believe that NATO enlargement is what caused this, you can say, okay, we're not going to enlarge NATO or whatever. But that's not what Putin cares about. And by the way, for sure he doesn't care about that, because Finland and Sweden just joined NATO, which are also border countries. Is he launching a war against them? No. It just doesn't make sense. And so, anyways, if you believe this, then he can't negotiate, because negotiating shows weakness. Weakness then is what he is what would hurt his power base. You can't be a weak strong man. And so, and by the way, it's in the 13 years I've been fighting with him, he's never compromised, negotiated, or done any rational thing that a person would do in any circumstance. He always escalates. And so, in my opinion, there's only two ways this thing is going to resolve itself. Either Russia wins or Ukraine wins. And if Russia wins, God help us, because what happens next is he moves on to other countries, and potentially NATO countries like Estonia. And then he tests us. And he says, are you guys ready to go to war with me over this little country that most people can't identify on a map? And he's hoping that we all say, well, actually, it's catastrophic to go to war with Russia. I mean, we don't even, public opinion wouldn't support it, and we're not going to do it. And if he does that, then all of a sudden he controls all of Eastern Europe, and he doesn't stop there. Or alternatively, we go to war with him, and that's equally catastrophic because he's got nuclear weapons. And so the other option is Ukraine wins. But somehow we've decided, when I say we, and not me, because I'm not involved in these decisions, but Biden and Jake Sullivan and at the National Security Council and Anthony Blinken have decided they want to give Ukraine enough weapons not to lose, but not enough weapons to win. And that's been stated explicitly. They're not that's not a speculation or a reading between the lines. They've said that. They're scared of Ukraine winning. And so as a result, we end up in this situation where this war is just going to drag on and on and on. There's no end in sight that I can see.
So if there's no end in sight to the war, and ultimately money is at the root of the issue, isn't money also the strongest weapon that we have? In other words, if Putin owns half the wealth of the oligarchs and is as wealthy as been outlined, what efforts could be made, or could Western powers have in stopping Putin and his cronies, or kind of pulling the rug out from under him? I mean, is money the only solution to this? Like, other than just seeing lots of people die over the next 5, 10, 15 years and just kind of funding that from our side and making that our contribution? Like, what is the way out for us?
Well, the way out is victory, is Ukrainian victory. If Ukraine pushes the Russian soldiers out of their territory, the Russian people will take care of Putin themselves. I'm afraid Russia pretty low at the moment, unless we do something more dramatic. And even if we do, in terms of weapons, we still have the problem that China could show up and provide weapons to Russia. I mean, money was the cause of this, but money is no longer the cause of this. Survival is the power, and survival are now the cause of this. I mean, and money, stopping the flow of money to Russia is important. It's a necessary condition, but it's not. But it doesn't solve the problem.
Right.
It's part of the solution. So what we need to do is we need to give the Ukrainians over military weapon advantage, so that they give them the jets, give them more tanks, give them more long-range artillery, so they can pummel the Russians who are in their territory. And the second part of the whole thing is to stop the flow of money that goes to Russia, so they can't afford it anymore. Because right now they're getting between 500 million and $1 billion a day of proceeds from the sale of oil and gas.
Right.
We continue in the West, and maybe the Canadians don't because you have your own oil and gas, but a lot of countries in the West continue to send money to Russia at the same time as we're sending tanks to Ukraine. It kind of doesn't make sense. We should stop that.
Yeah, I mean, I guess even if we stopped in the West, there's China, there's India, there's Iran, there's other sort of actors that are contributing to it. I guess maybe I just want to turn the attention to the kind of the financial world and the implications of the financial. Like, so let's go back a little bit. Like, you were the largest foreign investor in Russia, right? And just if you go back to that, those early days when you were running Hermitage, other than personal safety, like, what kept you up at night, and how did you even think about risk management in an environment where corruption and asset appropriation was so visibly rampant?
Well, I mean, it was interesting when I got there. The valuation of Russian companies were so low that they could steal. I mean, just to give you an example, Gazprom traded at a 99.7% discount to BP and Exxon per barrel of hydrocarbon reserves. So my logic was that it was what I called the horrible to bad trade, or the Nigeria to Brazil trade. And my logic was that you didn't have to have anything go well. You just had to have it go slightly less horribly, and you'd make a lot of money. Right. And so the idea was, and so it was very binary. I said to myself, if things don't work out here, then we'll lose all our money. But if things work out here, we'll make 5, 10, 20, 30, 40 times our money. And what's the probability of them not working out versus working out? I thought it was like 50-50. And so, I mean, it's different. If you're going to make 40 times your money in a VC thing, the chances are like 1 in 100 it's going to go that way. But this was 50-50. And so the risk management was just, I mean, the only thing risky was just to sit on your positions and let them do all the stealing. And so, my strategy was buy these ridiculously undervalued shares, knowing full well that there's just fraud rampant in the most extreme forms, and then try to find a way of pressuring them, leveraging them to stop or do less stealing. They didn't even stop, just do less stealing.
Right.
And the way that I went about doing that was to figure out how they were doing the stealing. And the way I did that was that Russia is actually a very porous, transparent place because there's no data protection there. If I was meeting with you in Moscow, I mean, all this information gets gathered about everybody. It's like a sort of total police state kind of thing, not just with the police, but with all different bureaucracy. Everything is being tracked, and almost everybody sells the information for nothing. I mean, so I could spend like $100 and I could find out your bank balance and like where you traveled to and what your phone, who you called in the last month. And I could do the same thing with these big Russian companies. And so we figured out how they were stealing, who was stealing, and then ran these hugely embarrassing naming and shaming campaigns where we would expose them in the Wall Street Journal and the Financial Times.
Right.
And that really for a while, that really had a big impact. And again, we didn't have to stop it. We just had to get it a little bit less. And so I mean, we actually made a lot of money in Russia because we were for a while on the horrible to bad trade.
Yeah. And during that time, I mean, you were there during the, if I'm not mistaken, during the Russian ruble crisis. I can't imagine you were spared of that.
No, not
Uh,
at all.
so how were you affected, and kind of what did you learn through that experience?
So I lost 90% of my fund went down 90% during the default and devaluation in 1998. We went from $1 billion of assets under management to 100 million.
Hmm.
Um, and what was and that was that was sort of what the sort of catalyst that sort of launched me into being a shareholder activist, because before the 1998 crisis, the oligarchs had kind of behaved themselves. I mean, not completely or whatever, but they were sort of tentatively not stealing from their minority shareholders, because these bankers would show up with their Italian suits and their Hermes ties in Moscow, and from Goldman Sachs and Morgan Stanley, and they would say, "So the oligarchs, you've got a great oil company here. We could really help you develop it. We could get you some free money on Wall Street." And the oligarchs would all lick their lips and say, "Wow, that sounds great. We'd love some." And then these guys would say, "Well, there's just one condition. You can't steal from your minority shareholders. Can't create a scandal." And the oligarchs were like, "That's a tough one." And
Hmm.
then they say, "Okay, well, why don't we just like get the money and then we can steal later?" And so for a while they were behaving themselves, but then the crisis and the crash came in August of 1998. The Russian government defaulted on their domestic debt, their things called GKOs. They devalued their currency by 75%, and the stock market went down 90%. And I lost 90% of my clients' money. And at that point, it was very interesting because the oligarchs. Well, so in theory, that should have been the moment that everything immediately bounced back, because I owned oil companies.
Hmm.
All the oil companies sold their oil in dollars, but they paid for their costs in rubles, and the ruble is devalued by 75%. Oil hasn't devalued by anything, and so in theory, the profits should have exploded in these companies. The only problem was that the oligarchs, these guys who controlled the majority of these companies, um, uh, they started calling up their bankers down at Goldman and Morgan Stanley to say, "Hey, can we get some of that money you promised?" And the bankers were like pretending they never even heard of these oligarchs before, because nobody wanted to like admit that they had done any business in Russia. Russia was like radioactive waste, and so as a result, the oligarchs said, "Well, wait a second. If this money is no longer there as an incentive to behave, if Wall Street is closed for business, and
Yeah.
there's no disincentive against misbehaving, we might as well just steal every last penny we can get." And that's what launched me into being a shareholder activist. And so my risk management was to fight the stealing, and we fought it very well. And in fact, from the bottom of the market, from my 100 million, we went up to 4.5 billion by doing these naming and shaming campaigns.
Yeah. I mean, if you look today, I mean, what's interesting is, just speaking of the ruble, the Russians have artificially propped up their currency by ostensibly prohibiting the conversion of rubles to dollars, or making it difficult to get rid of rubles by foreign goods. Does you just this is a total non sequitur, but I'm curious, does this situation increase the use case or utilization of cryptocurrencies domestically? Does it change actually the thesis around that? Any thoughts that you have on that before we get too
Well, so the main use case for cryptocurrencies for Russians is not about rubles being, not about the ruble being stable or unstable. The main use case is that they've all been either under sanctions or at risk of being under sanctions, and they can't move dollars around the world, or euros or sterling or Swiss francs or whatever. And so you need an alternative currency, and so you need a way to launder your money.
Hmm.
So that's why. I mean, it's really interesting. I go to Davos every year. I've been doing it for 27 years, and then the main street of Davos, the promenade that sort of approaches the Congress Center where the World Economic Forum takes place, all these storefronts put themselves up for rent, uh, and they all get, and like during the dot-com boom, it was dot-com companies, and during anyways, until very recently, it was all these cryptocurrency companies, and like everybody was Russian. Um,
Wild, wild. Um, well, in the process of running or actually launching Hermitage, you met with some extraordinary individuals, and whether it was George Soros or Templeton, and then ultimately you got your first capital from Safra to start Hermitage. Just any lessons stood out from you from interacting with some of the greatest legends in the financial world, and some of them being your investors? Like, what did you learn from them, or from working with them or interacting with them?
well, I learned that there it's I mean there's a reason why some of these people are as rich and successful as they are, because they're wiser, smarter, and have better judgment than most of the people out there. I mean, there is something, it's not an accident that George Soros is George Soros. He has got a special way of looking at things. And it doesn't mean that he's always right. I mean, he's just maybe right 62% of the time, but everyone else is only right 30% of the time.
Yeah.
He get I mean, I've seen him get things wrong, and all these other guys. Edmund Safra, my partner, he got it very wrong. He was betting big on the bonds in Russia before the default and devaluation, but there's something very sort of unique about these people, in terms of their ability to. I think probably the key thing is that none of them have so much pride in an idea that they're not really willing to change their mind, when they see more information to tell them otherwise. I think that's probably, they've forgotten that they were bullish about something. They become very bearish very quickly, and they're willing to do that. And I think that a lot of people, a lot of even very smart people I know, once they've sort of come to a conclusion about something, it's very difficult for them to say, I may be wrong about that.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, they seem to have sort of some of that wisdom and good judgment even in their bones. I mean, I think it was Soros who used to say, I know it's a bad decision when my back starts to hurt, or something like that. But anyway, I just coming back, and again, maybe apropos to Soros, he obviously had very strong macro views. When thinking about the macro situation today, and whether we're talking about supply, demand, commodities, inflation, whatever, longer term, what do you think are the second order financial implications of this war or Russia's current positioning in the world? How does that impact your macro view, if at all?
Well, I think that it's we're now pairing off between the sort of free democracies of the world and the autocracies of the world. And Russia is an extreme example, but basically everything in Russia that people thought they had that was very valuable is now worth zero. I mean, I was talking to someone at Goldman the other day. They had to write off a $700 million portfolio to zero. Um,
Wow.
BP, I can't remember the number. It's like in the tens of billions. They've written it down to zero. Um,
Hmm.
that's real. I mean that,
Yeah.
and that I mean that is, that's not tail risk. That's just absolute catastrophe risk. And where does that come from? It comes from ignoring tendencies of illegality and murder and bad conduct and so on and so forth. Well, who else has those same tendencies? China.
Hmm.
China is an integral part of the world economy right now, and China is doing a lot of really nasty stuff. They've got what they've done in Hong Kong, what they're doing with the Uyghurs and Xinjiang, and we can all say, well, what's that? That's Hong Kong, that's Xinjiang, the small places, whatever. But if that's what they're willing to do, then why wouldn't they do that with Taiwan? Why wouldn't they start a war with Taiwan? Why wouldn't they do stuff that will end up getting us into a situation where we have to do the same thing that we've done with Russia? And maybe
Right.
it's different with China than Russia. I don't know, but the point is that I think that the world is going to become. I mean, I just read the other day that a bunch of Apple suppliers are now fully, getting out of China. Even Chinese suppliers are like setting up company operations in Vietnam because it's just, China is becoming too toxic a place. And so I think that we haven't even begun to see how that's going to play itself out. Even if China doesn't do anything terrible, just because of what Russia has done and the consequences of what Russia has done, people are going to say, you know what, we don't want to be dealing with authoritarian regimes anymore. And then what does that mean? I mean, well, China is probably the low cost producer, so prices go up. Um, people don't, used to just buy with like 1 week's delay, and now they're going to have an inventory of 1 month and all sorts of stuff like that. I mean, you're going to have to
Right.
spend your whole life, redrawing the economic models of different companies based on this world that's no longer a globalized world where everyone can do business with everyone, and then political risk doesn't exist, and so on and so forth.
Hmm. And so, yeah, I mean, there's certainly a lot of reasons that you mentioned to be bearish about some of these what were emerging and growing and penetrating economies. Um, Let me ask you the other perspective, the other side of that question, which is where and how and what, if any, opportunities does that create? And maybe you mentioned earlier that transition when companies go from wildly risky to highly risky, or you phrased it as from horrible to bad, right? So do you believe that opportunities like those exist today? And if so, where? Is there a geography where a younger Bill Browder can kind of have a similar success story? And I think the other question I would ask you is just because a lot of the participants on the call today are single family offices. Obviously, you have your own single family offices. How do you think about just investing your own capital today? Any thoughts would be helpful there.
Well, there's two types of investing. There's investing to get rich, and there's investing to stay rich.
Right.
So it all depends on where you are on that thing. So if you're a young guy coming out of business school like I was, whatever, 30 years ago, I didn't have anything. I came from a very middle class family. My total life savings was $2,000, and so I wanted to get on the map. And so in order to do that, I happened to be, and I happened to spot this crazy valuation opportunity in Russia, which, where they were basically giving everything away for free. And after they gave it away, it started trading at a slight premium to free, which was still free. Um, uh, and everyone always asks me whenever I go to business schools around the world to give talks, like, what's the next thing like Russia was for you? And the answer is nothing will ever be like that ever in the future of financial markets.
Hmm.
Again, it was such a crazy mistake that they made doing what they did, and it didn't work out for anybody, as we see now, for how Putin is behaving and what led to that. It's not going to happen. In order to make outsized returns, you're going to have to take outsized risks. I mean, that's just as simple as that. I kind of think that we're now entering into a world where, this zero interest rate policy for the last decade plus really distorted things and made smart investing not a very relevant skill. The stuff that went up wasn't smart investment stuff. It was speculative. I mean, basically, things you could look to indefinite profits in the future or profits in some point in the future, and it didn't have to be anytime soon, and it didn't have to be definable, and you could value it as something really a lot today. That's not going to happen anymore. And so I think we're now re-entering a world where, being a smart investor actually will pay off, being an active investor, like to find things that are undervalued, find things that, now all of a sudden you can buy fixed income. I couldn't buy fixed income for 10 years. Why would you buy a fixed income if interest rates were zero? Now you start out with a base rate of 4 or 5%. There's all sorts of interesting stuff that can happen off the back of that. I think that all of a sudden, equities have gotten really beaten up a lot of equities, and particularly things that, and so, if you can be a long-term investor and be a smart investor, you come back to these Benjamin Graham principles and so on. Now, as far as, what I do, I made all of my money in public equities in emerging markets, and I've got no money invested in that anymore. I pretty much focus on private equity in developed markets. First of all, I like developed markets because there's a rule of law. I don't ever want to go to a place where somebody can make an arbitrary decision, take my money away from me and not have any recourse. I want to be able to go to a court and say that was mine, not yours. We agreed on that, and the court says you're right, it was, and there you go. I don't want to ever have somebody think that they can do that again. And you can spend half your emotional energy on 2% of your portfolio if you go to bad places and people do bad stuff to you. So I don't ever want to do that again. And I tend to like private equity more than public equity because the incentives are so much more aligned, where if you buy a company and you have the ability to control the company, You can put in you can put in management, you can do things, you can fix things, you can fire people, you can change the capital structure. And so you have a lot more levers to make money in public equities. Like when I was in Russia, you can have management who is maybe whose incentives are not the same as yours, doing bad stuff, and then you have to like spend all this energy trying to convince them that they should do something right. And so the most direct for me, the most direct way of making money is to do it in places where I'm close to the control of the situation. I can understand what they're doing. If I don't like what they're doing, I can change it, and I know that I'm legally entitled to the profits of the venture when it all comes good.
Yeah, and I loved your expression, there's stay rich investing, there's get rich investing. I mean, we talk about that all the time here. And but it's also, you've kind of had a very mature perspective on it that a lot of people struggle with. So, and one of the things I'm curious about, the growth that you witnessed in your Hermitage portfolio, where you had 10 baggers or even 100 baggers in public markets.
Yeah.
That must have been addictive. I mean, so you have a lot of entrepreneurs that have been used to creating extraordinary wealth, and then all of a sudden go to managing a passive portfolio, a more diversified portfolio, and now they're like taking out 7, 8, 9%. They're like, oh, what am I doing? What am I wasting my time for? So I guess the question I have for you is, how did you get over that proverbial dopamine hit that you must have gotten so many times in your career as you were seeing these extraordinary successes?
Well, part of the reason that is that I don't spend that much time on my portfolio. I'd actually do better not spending time on my portfolio. So I spend most of my time as a political activist fighting for Magnitsky acts around the world, and in doing so, I don't have the bandwidth to watch a screen or do any of that kind of stuff. And remarkably, by not getting involved so intensely, my performance is much better than when I'm watching and getting scared and getting bearish and bullish and greedy and so on and so forth. By being a bit dispassionate about the whole thing, by not watching it, by not reading every article about everything, I actually do much better. I mean, my returns are much better.
Yeah.
And I get my dopamine hits now from getting a new law passed or having a successful Senate testimony or something like that. And I actually get much more joy from changing the world than I do from making money. Now, I mean, it's easy to say that because I made money, and so I'm not, everyone, my family is gonna be able to feed themselves and educate themselves and house themselves, and so we're all okay. I don't want to be sort of presumptuous about other people's circumstances, but for me now, I can move up Maslow's hierarchy of needs and go after find meaning in life and work on a mission that I think is important.
So let's turn to that mission, because I know we have 10, 15 minutes left, and I just want to spend a little bit of time on that. First of all, you've done so many extraordinary things, and other than, love to hear where you think your greatest ability to help have impact is today. What still sits on that proverbial bucket list from a kind of a changing the world perspective? I mean, obviously, we're seeing just dozens of countries that are passing legislation. I imagine it's not the next or incremental country, but again, I'd love to hear your reflections or how you're thinking about it.
Well, so I mean, like everybody else, I watch, I turn on my TV or I watch these videos on Twitter of the war in Ukraine, and it's just horrifying, beyond belief horrifying. And like everybody else, I want to do something. And some people are like sending money, some people are loading up ambulances, some people are going to the front and working as paramedics. Well, so I say to myself, I've been a victim of this regime. There has been the murder of Sergei Magnitsky and the murder of several other people I'm very close to. I know what this regime is capable of, and now they've expanded that by like 200,000 times. The deaths of and so I really want to play a part in trying to help the victims because I've been a victim myself. And so where do I have a unique skill set? Well, I've spent the last 13 years traveling around the world, visiting parliaments and governments, trying to get laws passed to freeze the assets of the Russian government and their crooks. Well, there's now a very unique situation, which is that a week after the war started, Western governments froze $350 billion of Russian central bank reserves. And there's now people whining and complaining about the financial costs of the war in Ukraine. And so it seems like the most obvious thing in the world to me that that money shouldn't just be frozen, it should be confiscated and sent to Ukraine for their defense and their reconstruction. And I've got a unique skill set, which is I've got the networks, I've got the contacts, I've got the lawyers, I've got the government officials that I've worked with on freezing assets. And it's not a big leap to use that same network and skill set to go around and figure out how we can pass laws, upgrade laws so that those assets can be seized. And so that's my main world-changing project this year. And hopefully it's a this year project. It may take longer than a year. I mean, there's lots of obstacles and institutions and people that don't want to change and so on and so forth. But I think that this is doable. I think it's something which makes huge financial and political sense, and it's something which I'm very actively involved in.
Yeah, well, first of all, kudos for that, Bill. And then, you and I chatted the other day, and we were talking about the fact that Canadians have this Frozen Asset Repurposing Act, but doesn't have enough teeth yet, so to speak, from a policy perspective. So, we as Canadians, what could we still do? But I guess secondarily is, will other countries follow suit? And which countries really, other than perhaps the US, matter here most in understanding what needs to happen to achieve that freezing?
Well, so the Canadian Frozen Asset Repurposing Act is a great piece of legislation. I was involved in it. The problem is it just goes after private sector assets. It doesn't deal with the Russian state assets, which is the key thing.
Okay.
And so that needs to be, those state assets are in theory protected by a concept known as sovereign immunity, which means that in the same way as your embassy is like your sovereign territory in Ottawa, the Russian embassy in Ottawa is their sovereign territory, so are their reserves that are held at the Central Bank of Canada. And so you can't just seize it, that would be breaking the law. And so my idea is that you have to basically change the law. And to say that sovereign immunity always applies, except when a country has declared a war on a neighboring country and broken the law by doing so, and creating damages by doing so, and then the damages that are created are not covered are not protected by sovereign immunity. And nobody can do this by themselves. This would need to be done in unison by all major G7 countries in order for it to work, because you're effectively, to change international law, you have to change all the international players' laws. And so that has to be done. I interestingly, of course, the United States is usually the leader in these things, but the Russians never trusted the U.S., and so they only have about 20 billion of the 350 at the U.S. Federal Reserve. Most of the money is actually in Europe, and Europe is the hardest nut to crack because you've got all these sort of appeasers in France and Germany that kind of want to keep Putin sweet for after the war and so on and so forth. And so it's a complicated story. It's not, there's a lot of different moving parts. To get all countries to do the same thing at the same time is not going to be easy. But there's so much money involved that we will have to pay if the Russians don't pay, that eventually it seems to me that that's the obvious end game.
And so what could we as investors or successful entrepreneurs do today for Ukraine, or to clip the wings of the Russian government or the Russian aggression, or to help you in that endeavor?
Well, I mean, the great thing about being successful investors is that your voice matters more than in Canada, by definition, the politicians look to the big economic players to decide how to conduct their business. And if the politicians that you support should be told that before we start paying for the reconstruction of Ukraine, which we should all be willing to do, we should have the Russians pay for it, and you should bulldoze through the bureaucracy that's going to try to stand up in the way of this thing.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that if there's anything else further, I will circulate to the group if there's any way that we could specifically, or any language or lobbying efforts, please do let me know, and we'd be delighted to try to help. As we kind of get to the end here, I always love to ask some of our legends that we have the privilege of interviewing, as they reflect back on their lives and their inspirations and who the formative individuals, what were the more useful or most useful pieces of advice or nuggets of wisdom that anyone has sort of imparted on you? And then similarly, since, again, all the participants are on today's call are largely, affluent families, family offices, investors, what advice might you offer to affluent families, from your unique vantage point and experience?
Well, so probably the best advice I've ever gotten was from I had a boss at Solomon Brothers when I was first starting out my life as an investor. He was a very eccentric man. He wore the same tie every day, the tie that he like that he had a lucky day where he like made $100 million on the trading floor, and he just wore that same tie over and over and wore slippers in the office. He was a complete misanthrope, but he was extremely wise man, and wise and in fact he was such a misanthrope and so disconnected from everybody else that's why he was successful, was to not listen to the hubbub of the trading floor and not listen to what everyone else was doing, and I watched how he operated, and basically ever since I began being an investor, I kind of disconnected from what everyone else was thinking and just thought it all through myself and looked at the numbers myself and didn't look for affirmation from anybody else, because by the time it's been affirmed by everybody else, it's already priced in.
Mm-hmm.
And there can be situations where like, what does everyone else know that I don't know? And yeah, you have to look at that, and you've got to figure out what else is there that might be causing something to be mispriced and so on. But sometimes, and more often than not, sometimes nobody knows anything. And if you do your own work and you don't listen to what other people are doing and don't get pulled in one direction or the other. I mean, I never got sucked into any of this high valuation technology stuff just because I just didn't understand it. I just didn't understand why could something trade at 100 times sales, and I just wouldn't do that.
Yeah.
And I'm not saying that, yes, a lot of people made a lot of money doing that, and I don't want to fault anyone on this call who is doing that and being successful doing that, but I just couldn't do it because I couldn't understand it. And so I've been, sort of stuck to what I understand and what makes sense to me, and where valuation didn't make sense, and I did my work. And sometimes I was wrong. I mean, like everybody else. But generally, if you stick to your own convictions and you stick to your own analysis and you don't listen to what everyone else is saying, and you have the ability to do the analysis, it can end up being a lot, over the long term, it suited me a lot better than just, running with the crowd.
Right. Well, Bill, that was absolutely fabulous. Thank you so much for joining us today, for sharing your insights and wisdom, and being really ever so great, generous and gracious with your time. And we really appreciate it and hope you could do it again soon. So thank you.
Thank you very much. And you're doing this for a good cause. So I hope that you continue to do this, raise lots of money, and help out lots of people who are in need.